So, aircraft were added to Foxhole a few months ago, which is a game that until now has been mostly played on a 2D plane. While many players have been asking for planes to be added to the game for years, when they were finally introduced, it felt like the monkey's paw had curled. Planes were fairly overpowered at first, and any battlefield problem normally had a plane as a solution, and that's not a good thing. So aircraft were everywhere. They sidelined a lot of gameplay elements, even at sea. Naval battles became a rare, usually much more one-sided affair, depending on who brought the larger air force or the torpedo bomber. Since then, a host of nerfs to planes, buffs to ships, mechanical reworks, and several anti-air options were added and improved to facilitate naval and land forces' counterplay against air power. In a game as complicated as Foxhole, there was no way that the devs were going to get the balance right on their first try. I released a video on this topic when aircraft were first introduced, and many of you in the comments section pointed out how similar Foxhole's players' reaction was to the introduction of planes to naval warfare in real life, which absolutely destroyed navies to the point that everyone started strapping anti-air guns to ships and building carriers to provide air cover at sea. The top comment stating that everyone in Foxhole had Japanese anti-air and American air power kinda sums up the early airborne experience pretty well. Although, it's always very interesting to watch Foxhole mirror real history. Most of the time.
The Wargers will never expect this, for us to go around their imaginary line.
With the release of Update 64 and a few hotfixes preceding it, the devs have responded with a host of changes to the game that actually allowed many naval engagements to take place in Foxhole's 135th war. That update combined both of Foxhole's servers into one, and with returning players coming in, the population of the game was kind of in a decent shape now, leading to many exciting battles that I need to cover on this channel soon. So let's talk about the Navy first. Even before the airborne update, the Colonial Navy was seen as lacking. Its large ships and gunboats were perceived as worse than their warden counterparts, and much more difficult to use in general. This stigma would shrink the size of the Colonial Navy, while growing that of the Wardens. The airborne update introducing ship-killing planes exclusive to the Warden faction, such as the Torpedo Scout plane and the Torpedo Bomber, forced much of the Colonial Navy to cease operations or go completely underwater due to the threat they posed, while Colonial dive bombers continuously disabled the turrets of Warden ships to no end. Larger naval battles became a rare event, if any occurred at all. So, ships got some buffs. I like to think of the added armor as an in-universe response to aircraft appearing on the battlefield. Various ships received increases to their health pools, ammunition stockpiles, and in the case of the Colonial Submarine, their battery life. On top of this, large ships in general received an increase to their resistance to armor-piercing damage, while also trying to even the scales between the asymmetry of the ships. These now tankier vessels could survive far better against aircraft. For example, the old version of the Colonial destroyer would have required 193 scout plane mini torpedoes to sink via pure hit point damage, instead of flooding it with water. In the first airborne war, this resulted in a couple of sunken destroyers, with one even sinking deep in Colonial territory. Now, a destroyer would require 370 mini torpedoes to be sunk in the same way. Additionally, torpedo scout planes can now only carry 2 torpedoes instead of 4, further increasing the required number of sorties. If it took 49 fully loaded scout planes before, it now takes 185 to do so, and that's with scout planes now being much more fragile and anti-air guns having much better tracking. This makes using naval guns much more viable for taking out large ships instead of aircraft, making true naval engagements much more likely. Needless to say, losing large ships to torpedo scout planes is a much more unlikely occurrence now. Not that we didn't try. Even submarines are making waves after the update. While the Colonial submarine had seen a lot of use in recent wars due to the oppressiveness of the Warden torpedo bomber on any surface ships, the Warden submarine was used a lot less. The Warden torpedo bomber could sortie faster and at a much lower resource cost after all. But with Update 64, the Warden torpedo bomber got a massive nerf and rework of its mechanics, which I'll get into more later in the video. As a result, Warden submarines were seen in combat much more often. During the war, I joined destroyer crews hunting submarines down, and in this instance, we chased one only to find a second enemy submarine lying in wait. Well played, Wardens.
Oh,
RIP.
damn it.
Submarines were also used for some very creative surprise attacks. Some submarine operations carried a full load of infantry in them. They would sneak behind enemy lines, surface next to a parked ship, and the infantry would get on deck and fire RPGs until the enemy ship was sunk. Although in one case, a regular player was showing the carrier to his friend who was new to the game when one of these attacks happened. While the regular player messaged chat for reinforcements, the new player hopped onto the machine gun of the carrier and gunned down the RPG squad, possibly saving the carrier in the process. It's peak propaganda material. Even gunboat crews were getting more creative. While early on, lone gunboats were still losing crews to aircraft strafing runs, eventually some gunboat crews would mount machine guns on the back of their ships. And now that machine guns could actually point upwards towards aircraft, they could shoot back. And I've personally seen Wardens use their newly buffed infantry armor plating to maybe shrug off scout plane machine gun rounds while manning their own machine guns. The upcoming Update 65 will continue the trend of improving the Navy, with much awaited improvements to the ergonomics of both the Warden frigate and Colonial destroyer, while I'm still hoping for flak guns on large ships. These are all very welcome changes. And even more appreciated were the aircraft nerfs. Firstly, anti-air gameplay is a lot better now. The biggest thing with the newest update was the addition of self-propelled anti-air tanks, which were pretty good at discouraging planes from getting too close. And now, the average infantry soldier has more options too. Any mounted machine gun, be it on a tripod, boat, or half-track, can now point upwards, letting them shoot down planes. Anti-air tracking is now a lot better too. These AA buffs combined with the lowered HP of most aircraft along with individual aircraft parts now being much more breakable, greatly increase the risk of aircraft doing any sort of attacks.
Dude, behind you!
You're dead.
I'm dead, dude.
And in particular, almost everything could now delete scout planes. Scout planes used to be a scourge at sea and on land, with Warden torpedo scout planes striking the Colonial Navy from afar, and scout planes in general sniping infantry, especially medics, on land. In addition to having major accuracy, fuel consumption, and payload nerfs, these planes had a significant reduction in their health points, making them feel like they're made of paper now. In War 135, scout planes were swatted out of the sky in a lot of different ways. Machine guns, flak tanks, cannons, and even regular small arms can now take out scout planes. I've also had the dubious honor of taking an artillery shell to the face in a scout plane.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
I think that the exceptional high explosive resistance of the scout plane is the only reason I survived, until I had to turn away from a machine gun spray, before accidentally crashing into a mountain. I am probably not the best pilot. However, scout plane dogfights are a much more enjoyable experience now, because of the improved aircraft handling, balancing, and reduced time to kill.
Come on.
But trees remain big scout plane killers.
Ooh! Oh!
That was kind of embarrassing for both of us.
Update 64 also gave each faction a brand new scout plane, as an equivalent to the original Colonial Mine scout plane and Warden torpedo scout plane. They're supposed to have very similar characteristics to their counterparts now, unlike the scout plane discrepancies from the first airborne war.
Oh, sorry! Oh. I'm the worst pilot.
The place was swarming with enemy scout planes, but at least I took one out, I guess. All scout planes also got their payloads reduced. They can only carry 2 mini torpedoes instead of 4, or 2 mines instead of 3. This change, along with the reduced fire rate for mini torpedoes given during a hotfix for War 133, made it much harder to take down small ships from the sky. However, creative counters to block torpedoes, such as using walls of smaller ships, are still a common sight. There was even one instance I've seen of a field bridge being built when we flew swarms of torpedo scout planes to attack a frigate. We called ourselves the Mosquitoes. Whether these are what inspired the devs to add a real torpedo net for Update 65 is anyone's guess. At least with a real torpedo net, you probably can't drop a torpedo under the sacrificial small ship walls anymore. Despite all the nerfs, the mine scout planes did get a slight buff, increasing their fuel capacity by 50%. With their worse dogfighting characteristics and lack of torpedoes, this made them ideal for scouting. Scout planes being used for reconnaissance instead of acting as mini-fighters. Who could have seen this coming? They are quite useful for spotting incoming enemy fleets. There was, however, a major change for rearming any of the scout planes. Ordnance such as torpedoes or mines now needed a wrench to arm them, taking much more time instead of just quickly submitting them into the plane's inventory. This new mechanic would also apply to all the other planes, especially the bomber. Having to wrench each bomb into the bomber took far longer than submitting 35 bombs into the plane's inventory, greatly reducing the frequency of bombing sorties. This was a very much appreciated change for the sake of everyone on the ground or at sea in Foxhole. Bomber nerfs after the first airborne war were just as expansive as those of the scout plane. The bomb drop rate has been reduced, stall bombing no longer works, bombers have a minimum altitude to drop bombs, were made to be much more fragile, were moved to be the last thing on the tech tree after nukes, and rearming now takes several minutes. I'm only aware of one incident where bombers probably sank a large ship in War 135, unlike how rampant it was during the first airborne war. But there were attempts that got pretty close. If the war went on a little longer, maybe it would have been more prevalent. But those close attempts required multiple passes with multiple bombers. So hopefully we can get some naval flak guns to damage bombers to the point that they can't do a second or third pass. Both factions also had specialized bomber aircraft, with Colonial dive bombers that used to repeatedly disable enemy naval turrets at sea, forcing lengthy repairs requiring 250 metal beams. They were now, like all the other planes, much more breakable, and had half of their bomb capacity taken away. Many dive bomber crews had to play much more conservatively, and successful attacks on Warden large ships were much less frequent, lest they lose a valuable plane. This one time, a friendly dive bomber pilot headed for the Kurastrand airfield was begging for help in chat, as a Warden scout plane was chasing their plane, which lacked a tail gunner. Luckily, I was right there and hopped on an anti-air gun. Although, they could still do some real damage on land. Also seeing less use in the naval role were the menace of the seas, the Warden torpedo bomber. This thing was widely condemned as the reason for making naval engagements during the First Airborne War nearly non-existent, forcing the already struggling Colonial Navy out of the seas. I remember seeing calls for a Colonial torpedo bomber to be released as well, to fight fire with fire, but this probably wouldn't have solved anything, and would have just made the problem much worse, with the chance that neither faction would bring out ships at all. Luckily, saner heads prevailed. The submarine torpedo didn't belong in aircraft, and the devs listened. The torpedo bomber's submarine torpedoes would be replaced with the brand new medium torpedo, changing how torpedo bombers would be used going forward. The old torpedo bomber, sharing the abilities of the submarine torpedo, could create large holes in large ships. Large holes caused massive flooding inside a ship, until 52 metal beams were used on it one by one to repair the hole, causing major problems for damage control crews. While one large hole was a minor inconvenience for an experienced damage control crew, multiple large holes in different compartments typically spelled instant death for any ship at sea, which swarms of torpedo bombers excelled at doing. However, these new medium torpedoes, upon hitting an enemy large ship, had to roll for the chance to create a large hole, succeeding only 15% of the time. While I'm not too keen on luck-based mechanics, this was a massive relief to many naval players. Even if a swarm of torpedo bombers attacked a large ship, the chances of them putting a large hole in every compartment was very low. But once Warden air superiority was established, torpedo bombers would still see use, such as in the Battle of the Lycos Isles, where Colonial air support was outnumbered and the carrier had to pull back. And with the reworked and much more fragile torpedo bombers in the game, Warden submarines arrived in absolute droves once again. During War 135, a minimum of 27 Warden submarines were sunk according to the Seavish Naval Institute, which is the Warden Naval Discord server. That's 8 more than in the first 2 airborne wars combined. However, that's not to say that they're weak now, but rather that they're getting more use, despite large ships now being able to fully repair the large holes that submarine torpedoes make. Along with submarines, both sides would bring out their navies in War 135, finally allowing proper naval battles to inhabit Foxhole's waters once again. With both the Able and Charlie servers being combined into the live server, the United Naval Regiments got to work. Everything from gunboat rushes, long-range battles, submarine shenanigans, direct fire engagements that shouldn't be happening, to absolutely mad Pearl Harbor-style attacks at the end of the war when everything had to go. Naval warfare was pretty good in War 135.
Hello! This is not a carrier! This is not a carrier, sir!
But as with the First Airborne War, the Foxhole world was no longer round, and you couldn't keep sailing east to arrive west, effectively dividing the world of Foxhole into 2 different oceans, the West and the East. In the west, before large ships were even finished being researched, the Colonial's rapid advance towards Kura Strand forced any Warden naval regiments based in the west to be trapped in their ports, denying them the open ocean that they once dominated. This also made one of the more prominent Colonial naval regiments stationed in the west make a land battleship. The east, however, was an open brawl. Luckily, I was present for one of the larger battles as well, the second major battle at the Lycos Isles. It was quite the fight, with more than a dozen large ships entering combat, a Colonial carrier providing supporting air cover, and a very active airfield supplying Warden fighters and torpedo bombers. It's a battle I hope I can cover one day. While air cover is still important, the statement that the winner is whichever navy has the larger air force might not exactly be the case anymore, and I've seen plenty of ships go out with much smaller escorts and survive this war. And some that didn't. With all these aircraft being less effective against ships now, engagement ranges for naval battles were much closer, since planes weren't pushing everyone away from each other. By the end of War 135, when you look at the Warden or Colonial sunken enemy ship counts, the reporting was actually pretty close, and the Warden count even pointed out a KDR of 1.07 Colonial large ships sunk per Warden ship sunk. It's the closest it's ever been in a very long time. Naval invasions in the meantime had some surprises. Carriers made an appearance in a couple of naval invasions done by both sides, not as a support vessel, but as the main landing ship. On the Warden's side, the 18th Regiment used a Mercy aircraft carrier as a landing ship to attack Headsman's villa. Their leader preferred it to the Longhook landing ship because it had a battleship's hit points and a crane. The carrier's crane is normally used to pick up seaplanes for servicing, but it's still a crane. So the 18th decided to use it for tanks. Instead of either bringing a very expensive bluefin logistics ship or barges upon barges of uncrewed tanks, they brought freighters full of tanks and used the crane attached to the health pool of the carrier to drop them on the beach to replace any losses. That is some creative thinking. The only downsides were the initial cost of the ship and the small spawn room, and good traffic management can solve that. I was present for the first time they did this, but not the second, cursed invasion. I was over in Nevish Line observing a land battleship. On the Colonial side, the CDC regiment built a carrier, and when they brought it to Nevish Line to service aircraft, someone looked at its inventory and made a map post commenting on it. Because it was absolutely loaded. When I asked them about it, they told me they intended to use it as a landing ship at Nevish Line eventually. However, they had two problems. The storm cannon artillery pieces that could deal serious damage to ships, and the weather. You see, while CDC did like keeping the carrier around Kura Strand, the sudden blizzards repeatedly freezing the sea made keeping the heavily loaded carrier near the front line an extremely risky proposition. Enemy partisans could literally walk up to the thing and try to destroy it. The weather was pretty bad and I skill issued trying to land on the carrier. I should have gone for the airfield. I did manage to do it when the weather got worse for some reason.
Oh,
CDC would eventually get their chance, and used it at the Scrying Belt seaport. It's so interesting to see how strategies evolve in this game. The next of Foxhole's updates every 6 weeks should be dropping in the next few hours, but the devs snuck in update 67 to the roadmap. I wonder what's in that. I'll get the Neverschlein video done eventually. I just need some time.